A year after the end of the Patriotic War in 1946, military topographic units were sent to Altai and Sayan Mountains in order to clarify and compile detailed maps. Over the summer, teams of topographers literally traveled around the Altai-Sayan mountain system and visited almost all corners of the vast, sparsely populated territory. Throughout the summer, military topographers worked in very difficult conditions. Horses perished in the streams of mountain rivers, food, equipment and clothing perished. The main reason for the serious losses and hardships is that these units were 80% staffed from the inhabitants of the European territory of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, who found themselves in the difficult conditions of Siberia for the first time. But, despite the difficulties, the task was completed. In late August and early September, the last detachments left the mountain taiga, and some of them, after a short rest in our village, went to the place of deployment of the unit. One of the last to leave was a detachment under the command of a senior lieutenant and stopped in the village to rest. This detachment was unlucky. They were left without horses and lost almost the entire food supply, but they left the remote area of the Western Sayan Mountains, keeping their instruments, collected material and weapons, and most importantly, people. 12 people under the command of an experienced officer topographer moved to Lake Telexy, eating only what they got along the way, since there were soldiers in the detachment from the taiga villages of Siberia. Having approached the descent into the deep valley of the Bolshoy-Bakhan River, the detachment stopped. Far below, meandering, 3 rivers break out of the stone gorges and, joining in one stream, with joint efforts break through the mountains. A relatively narrow valley was formed here, along the bottom of which a Bakhan rushes rapidly towards the mighty Yenisei. Considering the harsh gorge and choosing the best option for crossing it, the officer drew attention to a small yellow spot on the left bank of the Aranat River at its confluence with the Bakhan. The officer began to look through binoculars at this spot, which is not typical for the area. Imagine his surprise when he saw the hut and people swarming around it. Firmly knowing that this is an absolutely uninhabited area, moreover, this is the territory of a state reserve, the officer suggested that it seems to be some kind of secret settlement, most likely of the Old Believers. Taking all precautions, the detachment descended to the bottom of the valley, but did not manage to approach the settlement that day. Having chosen a depth ravine, we stopped for the night in a place from where the light of the fire could not be seen. The next day the detachment, following the officer's order, split into 2 groups, surrounded the settlement and suddenly appeared at the very hut. Karp Osipovich, his wife and 2 children, 7 and 11-year-old Natalia were at the time at the hut, were engaged in winnowing pine nuts. The weather was fine. Natalia was the first to notice. Jumping to her feet, she, pointing with her hand, shouted in a heart-rending voice, "Dear darling." All the Lykovs jumped up, saw that they were surrounded on all sides by an armed detachment of the military, and froze in fear. They were so scared, so shocked that at first they lost their speech and ability to move, petrified, then slowly knelt down, began to cross themselves, making prayers. One can only guess what was in the souls of these people at the time. By the fact that all of them were baptized with 2 fingers, the observation officer understood that his assumption was confirmed. Before them were the Old Believers. Seeing the confusion and fear in the eyes of these people, the officer quickly approached the praying man with a thick beard, spoke and tried to lift him to his feet. However, the Old Believer, clutching the officer by the legs, leaning his cheek to the bootleg, froze. It even seemed that he was trying to kiss the boots. Meanwhile, the soldiers inspected the estate, and one of them went to the open door of the hut. "There is no need," the Old Believer said barely audibly, "there is a child." The officer stopped the soldier and asked how many there were. "Everyone is here," the Old Believer replied, crossing himself. The inspection stopped there. The officer barely managed to raise the Old Believer to his feet. He tried to calm him down, convincing them that the soldiers would not do anything bad to them. However, he muttered something incomprehensible and did not take his frightened eyes off his shoulder straps. As it turned out later, he could not understand why shoulder straps were on his shoulders. Lykov knew well that with the advent of Soviet power, not only estates were abolished, but also shoulder straps, and other insignia, and suddenly, shoulder straps. Has the Tsar's power returned? It must be said that all old believers, even in remote places far away in the Taiga, knew that the last autocrat of Russia, Emperor Nicholas I, at the very beginning of the century finally stopped all persecution of old believers and legalized this, so to speak, stratum of the population of Russia. They also knew that the entire family of the Tsar had died during the coup, so the shoulder straps caused bewilderment and some kind of fear. After there was relative calm, negotiations began. Upon learning that Lykov was in front of him, the officer was extremely surprised and said that he had heard this surname, and that the maps and documents indicated the Lykovs' domicile, but much lower along the river in a place called Tichy. Lykov confirmed that he had indeed lived for quite a long time in this small village, where he was born in 1902. Gradually, diplomatic relations improved, and conversations began to be more frank and confidential. To the officer's surprise, almost at the very beginning of the conversation, Karp Osipovich suddenly asked about the war. And when asked how he knew about the war, Lykov answered. Danila said. Lykov said that after the start of the war he had a military detachment, accompanied by his longtime acquaintance Danila Lykov. Lykov, apparently afraid of the consequences, did not say that he then hid with his family in the Taiga and met only with Lykov. The officer asked if that squad was here. Karp Osipovich said that at the time they lived on a counter 25 kilometers downstream of the river, on its right bank, but after the detachment left the place and moved here. Karp Osipovich said that there he had the administration of the reserve on the counter. They invited him to work in the protection of the reserve. However, after the appearance of the detachment, they realized that now they would not be left alone at this terrible time, so they decided to find another place to live. Here, on the banks of the Hermit river, on a small terrace above the river, surrounded by a dense birch forest, Lykov cut down a hut and, having moved with the whole family, they began to arrange their life as best they could. There was a war and no one else was in these places, and the Lykovs were forgotten for several years. It was not up to them. The officer spoke in detail about the war, about the victory, to which Karp Osipovich was sincerely glad, and, crossing himself, said, "Thank God, they beat the adversary." He also told that the old insignia were returned to the Russian army by the decision of the government. Thus the question of power, which was painful for the Lykovs, was resolved. The head of the family and the commander of the detachment talked for a long time about the war, about life in the Taiga, about the advantages of living in villages and cities. And in spite of the fact that Lykov listened attentively, slightly squinting his eyes, nodding his head in agreement, and saying, "Eater, eater," it was clear that he always remained at his opinion. The officer inquired about the terrain and, showing Lykov maps, clarified the directions of rivers, wetlands, passes through the passes and about many other things that related to his work as a topographer, and everything that he considered necessary was scrupulously entered into the documents. Lykov told where exactly his parents' family lived, where, in what places he lived with his family, where there were other settlements. Thus, he unwittingly took part in the processing of the collected material and in the compilation of maps of this remote area. And the very surname Lykov was immortalized on military topographic maps with the stamp, "Secret." All the Lykovs' residences are marked on these maps with the mark Zamka Lykov. In subsequent years, all scientific expeditions and tourist groups traveling in the Altai and Sion mountains used these maps and knew well that the Lykov family lived here in the Deep Taiga. All conversations, at the highest level, between the officer and Lykov, as a rule, began with requests not to touch them, and each time the officer tried to convince the Lykovs that they would not touch them and would not take them anywhere. But the officer but he touched on the question of what you need to think about children, about their future life. Mostly, the guests only contacted the head of the family, and everyone else did not take part in the conversations and were, as it were, beyond the bounds of communication. Sometimes the eldest son Savin would sit down and silently listen to the conversation, but Karp Osipovich, as a rule, found something to do with him and sent him on some household chores. The detachment spent 2 full days at the Lykovs estate. During this time, the soldiers had a good rest, repaired shoes, clothes, ate potatoes and plenty of fish. On the eve of leaving, the officer carefully checked everything that remained, and gave the Lykovs almost all the remaining salt, leaving himself just enough to last for the days of the march. In the evening, we agreed that Karp Osipovich would take them to the pass through the Abokan Ridge and indicate a less difficult route to the Teleksi Lake. Early in the morning, after the Lykovs prayer service and breakfast, we set out. Karp Osipovich took Savin with him. The journey was not easy for several days. They had to go down a little along the Abokan Valley, then leave to the left and, crossing the so-called Koltega, climb the Abokan Ridge and disperse here. The whole family came out to see off the detachment. Akulina Karlona was holding little Agafia in her arms, and Natalia, holding on to the hem of her crying mother, repeated, "Fyodor, don't go." Karp Osipovich went up to his wife and, seeing tears in her eyes, said, "Well, it will, do not cry, wait in 4 days." The officer also approached Akulina Karpovna and, bowing, thanked for the shelter and once again assured that they would return safe and sound. The soldiers loudly said goodbye, thanked for everything, wished everyone well-being and health. And so the team set off. A few minutes later the detachment disappeared into the taiga. Climbing the pass, we stopped to rest. In this place, it was going to be goodbye. The weather was great. Karp Osipovich told, showing on the ground how to go and, pointing into the distance at a huge hole in the mountains, explained that there is Lake Teleksi, and after a pause, added, "Wonderful lake." The officer inquired whether the weather would change, but Lykov reassured him, saying that the weather would still be good. After the rest, they began to say goodbye. The Lykovs were baptized, whispering prayers. The officer once again thanked Lykov for everything. Karp Osipovich crossed him over and said in a low voice, "With God." After passing about 200 meters, the officer looked around and saw both Lykovs standing still. They began to wave their hands. The Lykovs responded in kind, then crossed themselves, turned and walked away. Their grey figures flashed between the stones several times and soon completely disappeared into the thickets of a dwarf birch. Now they parted forever, some to the world, others to the deserts. Talking about the minutes of parting, the officer said that he felt somehow uncomfortable, and he was terribly sorry for these lost adults and frightened children, in whose eyes he saw anxiety and fear all day. Lykov Sr. did not heed the voice of reason and this time, did not absorb all the good that was told to him, only one thought drilled into his head, to leave, and immediately after parting with the detachment, they hurriedly moved home. Despite the fatigue, we went quickly, now mostly down. We didn't feel fatigue, we walked until dark. We stopped in the thick of the taiga, made a fire, had a snack and lay down to rest, as agreed, up to a month. 3 or 4 hours later, as soon as the moon rose, we moved on and early in the morning on the 4th day, as promised, found ourselves, to the great joy of everyone, in the native walls of a small house. It must be assumed that Lykov repeatedly returned in his thoughts to everything that the officer had told him about. Children are the main thing about whom one had to think about their future arrangement. The Lykov couple, both in their thoughts and in secret conversations among themselves, probably touched on this topic. They understood perfectly well that the hour was not far off when the laws of nature would require rapprochement with their own kind in order to procreate. Lykov also remembered the content of the conversations that took place when he unexpectedly appeared at the reserve cordon in 1940. Then the fate of children was also the main topic in conversations. However, fear took its toll, and the Lykovs had a reason. There was fear in my blood. Persecution from year to year, from century to century, all this firmly entered the consciousness, and it was terribly difficult to change anything. And the events of the last 15-16 years that took place on the territory of their native Russia, especially the year 1937, which caused alarm, were so frightening that the Lykovs finally came to the conclusion that they would not be forgiven for leaving the desert in 1937. The officer said during the conversation that everyone who shirked from military service during the war was seriously punished. It was the seed that firmly sunk into the soul and sprouted. In this case, along with other reasons for leaving, it was the main thing that generated fear. Therefore, it was decided to leave for a new place, since people, knowing where they live, will definitely come. Immediately after returning home, they began to collect, and, taking advantage of the good weather, Karp Osipovich and his son took the necessary instrument, went to a pre-chosen place. This Tega Elim, where it was necessary to settle for many years, was surrounded by a century-old cedar taiga, which, according to Lykov, was a more reliable place where it was much more difficult to find them. Here, on this Alani, the prudent Lykov, 3 years after his resettlement to Yernat, cut down the log house, covered it and left it in case of a sudden resettlement. And now it came in handy. The disadvantage was that Elan was much higher in the mountains than their estate on Yernat. Here, a little later, it was warm. Earlier there was a cold snap and snow fell, so the vegetative period in the life of plants was shorter, which could not but affect the cultivation of garden crops. However, many years of experience suggested that if you do everything on time you can achieve success. There was a good stream flowing here that never dries up, which was also very important. There were several places selected for secret residence, but this, where they went, was the most suitable. 5 months later, a special detachment sent in winter to evict the Lykovs literally traveled across the upper reaches of the Bolshoy Obokan, but the Lykovs were never found. Well, this will be discussed in detail, and now the two Lykovs have left, making the sign of the cross and whispering prayers, to their new place of residence, where no one and nothing was waiting for them. Around the taiga dense, severe, a little blundered, and you will perish, there was a man and no one will look, so, then, God pleases. But, having a huge life experience of living in extreme conditions, Lykov controlled literally every step of all family members, carefully watched and constantly taught what and how to do, what to fear, what to take into account when doing something, and for many years disconnected from the whole world, he practically did not make any serious mistakes. In that short period of time that remained until winter, a lot had to be done, to finish building the hut, clean the garden and move everyone together with simple belongings and supplies to a new place of residence. They worked from dawn to dawn, interrupting only for meals and prayers. The Lykovs were in time. We did almost everything that was needed to live in a new place, at the cost of incredible efforts and almost round-the-clock work, and managed to transfer almost all the vegetables. Only some of the auxiliary equipment remained, a part of the potatoes and a store full of pitch-black rusks. This was the end of this alarming autumn, which brought so much suffering to the entire family living in constant fear. They left and sank into the water. There were none. There remained a small house with an empty eye socket, the size of a mitten, instead of a window, to prove that life had glimmered here quite recently. The weather turned bad. The peaks of the harsh, silent mountains were enveloped in a dirty grey fog, it rained and the north was already breathing a serious cold. Day and night, the Lykovs prayed, giving praise to God for giving mostly good weather for almost the entire time of the resettlement. Lykov remembered that it was not for nothing that the schismatic elders said, "Pray day and night, and the Lord will send grace, and there will be salvation." And so it happened. Gone, and as if they had never been here. Nobody interfered. We were saved. Here, in the remote taiga in 1947, the Lykov's son Dmitry was born. A detachment of military topographers safely overcame the last kilometers, descended to Lake Telexy at the mouth of the Koksha River and arrived by water in the village of Yelu. Here the officer spoke in detail about the Lykovs, about his help to the detachment and drew attention to the extremely difficult situation of the family. The officer's report about the meeting with the Lykovs was received with surprise in our village. The fact is that everyone was sure that the Lykovs, after meeting in 1941 with a detachment of border guards and Enkv officers, which we talked about, went down the river to the village of Tichy. In any case, this was what Lykov advised then, and Lykov agreed with this proposal. Talking about the Lykovs in our village, the officer said that no matter what the conversation was going on, Karp Osipovich never objected, did not contradict, and the officer explained this behavior by the fact that Lykov, apparently, was afraid to object or express disagreement, so as not to anger the interlocutor, and agreed with everything that was said, although he clearly felt insincerity. I drew attention to extreme poverty, misery, to the fact that although they somehow communicated, the tension was constant, either from the overwhelming fear that gripped them, or from the fact that they were so wild that they could step over this line, calm down and believe they were unable to do good. In any case, such an impression was created. Therefore, the officer did everything possible to somehow convince them to calm down, overcome themselves and think that it is impossible to live like this all the time, that you need to think about your children and yourself. This was an official announcement, so the management of the reserve notified the regional party committee of everything and reported to the regional authorities. The director of the reserve, Martinov, was summoned to the regional party committee, where he was given the appropriate suggestion that a family of old believers was hiding on the territory of the reserve entrusted to him, thus violating a number of state laws. In addition, Lykov was accused of hiding in the taiga. He shirked from military service and did not take part in the defense of the motherland during the war years, and the management of the reserve should not contribute to this. After discussing this issue, it was proposed to send a detachment of observers with representatives of the Enkv in order to bring the Lykov family out to the people, arrange it, and bring the head of the family Karp Osipovich to justice. Please share this video on your social networks, using the buttons under the video, and subscribe to the channel. I ask you to go and watch other videos about Agafia Lykova, which you can see now on the screen in the end screensavers. There are a lot of rare and interesting facts about the Hermit. Thank you all for watching.